Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome back. I'm Keisha Rogers, and I want to thank you all for joining us for our Monday strategic discussion and overview. I'll be joined by Michael Stager today. Today is June 5th, and I want to, first of all, welcome those of you who this is your first time on the call. You're joining us. Also, those who are joining us on these calls every Monday and giving insight to how you're going out there and bringing about the needed solutions and the vision to restore this great nation once again to making America great again. So we're going to be talking about that, but the theme of today's discussion is going to be very fun. It's going to be taking up the latest developments in what President Donald Trump has organized as his Agenda 47. And many of you may have heard a remarkable speech given by President Trump recently. It was about a 4-minute clip where he discussed a very exciting vision that he has for our country for the 250th anniversary celebration coming up in 2026. And President Trump calls for a celebration of 250 years of American independence at the Iowa State Fairground. And so we're going to be discussing that tonight, also discussing this question of what was it that we actually gained, what or who did we gain our independence from? Where does that fight stand today in the fight to keep our republic, to continue to keep our independence, and what is it that we want to bring about in terms of the optimism and vision for our nation at a time when you have so much chaos, destruction going on. We know we've been facing several years of devastation with the continued lawfare attacks on President Trump, the witch hunt, the Russia collusion, and what we have been facing in the recent period and really ongoing with those who want to continue to push the United States and the world to the brink of nuclear war. And if you missed the SITREP report that was on the LaRouche PAC website, I encourage everyone to go to LaRouche PAC website and look at the report done by our colleague Barbara Boyd. Washington plays kabuki while World War III looms large. Lawfare against, and this is taking up the lawfare against President Trump. President Trump has recently talked about the boxes hoax and how he's continued to be targeted. But in the midst of this, I think what's really important is the article that was just recently written, and I'll post it up here for just a second for you to see on our website, so people who are new to the website, larouchepac.com, can see this very extraordinary article that was written by Bob Ingram. President Trump makes himself the personal rallying point for the principles of 1776. And Bob really takes up the vision that President Trump lays out for the 250th anniversary and what he wants to see accomplished with a year-long celebration. But he also talks about this in the context of the 100th centennial celebration of our nation in 1876, and some of the features that went along with that, and the ingenuity and accomplishments that really inspired not just our nation, but the entire world. And we'll dig into that a little bit more, and also our proposals for what would be necessary for those who will be developing this centennial, developing this 250th anniversary celebration and putting this together, what they should be thinking about in that context. So I'll post this up in the chat for people to see. Otherwise, people who are watching later on YouTube, if you go to our website, I really encourage you to watch that. All right, I'll take that down now. And So with that, there's a lot to discuss, and I will just say, I think I'll just turn it over to Michael now for him to open up his remarks, and then we will take questions afterwards from those on the line here with us tonight. I'll just say when he finishes his open remarks, I'll let you know how to get in. You'll press *9 and join the discussion. But otherwise, if those of you who are participating on YouTube afterwards and watching this, you can make comments. We'll try to get back to some of your comments. Otherwise, we'd encourage you to go to our website and sign up to join the discussion with us here on our Zoom calls. So with that, Michael, why don't you go ahead?
Great. Thanks, Keisha. Okay. Hi, everyone. There's an intrinsic nature to living in the United States, in that we are largely isolated from much of the rest of the world. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not interconnected today, but geographically speaking, and prior to the 21st century, second half of the 20th, the questions of geography had a lot of a bigger role. And in some sense, that has shaped the culture in the United States around the questions of what's happening around the rest of the world. For a large portion of Americans today, still do not even consider really US foreign policy as a subject. If they consider politics, they consider it largely from the standpoint of taxes, Medicare, economy, jobs. At certain points, the threats of war will impact American political discourse. But more often than not, and we've seen this over the last 20 years, they've gotten away with murder in Washington, D.C. with a perpetual war policy. Because to a large extent, the Americans are removed. And that's to some extent geographical in its nature. We didn't really have to worry about it. Reports go, in the 20th century, accepting John Quincy Adams' commitment towards sovereignty in the Americas. He was Secretary of State when the Monroe Doctrine is formed. It wasn't, some people try to liken that to an imperial policy in the Americas, but it wasn't as initially formulated. It was adapted later under more of a kind of the current policies we have today. But it was a commitment to the sovereignty of those nations so that foreign countries like France, Britain, Spain, and others couldn't colonize them with massive financial debt. But it really wasn't a concern for most Americans. Our foreign policy was largely concerned with the economic enterprises. Can we do business? Can we do industry elsewhere? In some sense, we didn't even really have an ally until Russia backed up the United States during the Civil War period. It basically threatened that if Britain or France entered the war, that Russia would enter on the side of the North because they would enter on the side of the South. And they made a clear show of commitment when they entered into New York and San Francisco harbors with their naval ships. Now, I say this because for most of the 20th century, for most of the 19th century, we remained a nation committed towards our economic and industrial orientation. And that set the tone for our foreign policy. And you'll see what I mean as I proceed. But I want you to start from that standpoint, because I think everybody on this call is well aware that we don't really follow closely foreign policy questions. And what that makes us susceptible to, I'm not speaking about you personally or anyone else, but I'm talking about the general American population. And that makes us susceptible to a lot of lies and manipulations from the propaganda machines, from Washington, the so-called experts. We all know the kind of dynamic. We've lived it now in somewhat the horrors of the last 20 years, if not the last 50, going back to Vietnam. Now, I raise that because the policies today we have adopted towards Russia. And again, Russia was our first real ally. We weren't allies with the French. We basically became major opponents to the French after their revolution. And this was a major heated fight between Washington and Jefferson, but we've presented on that before, and we can revive that for people if you're interested. But Washington was solely dedicated not to getting involved in the quagmire of the French Revolution, which was just foreseeably a disaster. So why is our policy towards Russia today concerned with expansion of NATO into countries like the Baltic nations? These are the nations that are, on the Baltic Sea up near Finland, north of Poland, just west of St. Petersburg, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. But nations, why do we have missiles positioned in Poland and Romania? Missiles that could be nuclear armed and target Moscow within a short 30 less than an hour. Why was Georgia, a nation really not even in Europe? It's more closely connected to Turkey and Iran in the Caucasus. It's east of Turkey. Why was Georgia offered possible entry into NATO by George Bush in 2008, as well as Ukraine? Now, we might assume that this is all just natural, that it has some coherence. And most Americans are largely shaped by the Cold War, that we were in a contest with Russia and they were dominating Eastern Europe. And so this was the area of contest. And so it makes sense in some ways that we would want to dominate this area or have interest in it. We would have somehow US interests would manifest themselves in some way in Eastern Europe. Now, that you might be able to argue that logically, but what no one can deny, no one, is that the policy we have adopted today in Eastern Europe, and as we see it in Ukraine, or in Georgia, or Romania, or Poland, or the Baltics, or Finland, is exactly British foreign policy since the mid-18th century. That it is nearly identical with British policy towards Eastern Europe, both for two purposes: to weaken Germany, to make sure Germany is weakened, because Germany was quickly becoming a threat in the 19th century, but it was also a major military power as Prussia in the 18th. And to contain and push Russia and keep Russia out as a dominant European force. Now, this is not contestable. What I'm saying is, like, the policy towards Ukraine, the policy in Poland, in Romania, in the Baltics, in Georgia, these nations have been targeted, in Crimea, have been targeted by the British for 250 years. Almost in, it's evolved and changed over time, but nearly identical for over a century. Merely almost 150 years of almost an identical British policy. And I raise this because many of you know, and Lyndon LaRouche would reference this all the time, is that the United States has been taken over by the British Empire. Now, that can mean multiple things. It can mean our educational system, like including universities, have been dominated by kind of neo-Darwinian scientific reductionism, free trade, British liberalism, and economic and political thinking. All kinds of examples. You can reference the Christopher Steele, Russiagate, and the attempted coup against President Trump. You can reference the House of Lords report. You could reference different things. But it's unmistakable that we today, in foreign policy, have exactly the same foreign policy of the British Empire. Remember, the British Empire, though roughly it's coming into existence by the late 1680s, is not consolidated as the global force until 1763. They defeat the French in practically a world war. They fought in India. They fought in Southeast Asia. They fought in Europe. They fought in the North American colonies. It was a world war for who had global naval dominance, global dominance of trade. And the French lost. We call it the French and Indian War, and the British won. They were dominant since that point. And the policies we have towards Russia today are unmistakably British imperial policy towards Russia. It's unmistakable. This is not a question. It is mapped almost one for one exactly. And it's not surprising then that the British have been dominant in pushing the Ukraine situation, including Boris Johnson, the entire time, because we are the dog getting wagged by the tail is one kind of reference. But that's what LaRouche was referencing. Now, that war in Ukraine, the high priests of this British system thought that they could punish it with these new modern forms of warfare, of financial warfare called sanctions. They thought we could sanction Russia into economic oblivion. That didn't work. It completely and totally failed. Remember, Biden even said, I would never send F-16s. I wouldn't send tanks. We're not going to send any major armaments. We're just going to do basically some major banking sanctions and so on. And this is going to really punish Russia. Russia is doing stronger today than it's ever done. There's been clear studies done. You know what happens when you banish nations from having trade with other countries? They rapidly fortify their own capabilities. And the population politically, like in Russia today, or China today, is mobilized to contribute their own domestic production as a way of winning the financial and economic war. So Russia is stronger. In essence, the European countries, the United States, is much weaker since this war began. But Ukraine has apparently launched this great offensive. Is it a great offensive? That's hard to say. Is there going to be a major victory on the battlefield? That's hard to say. Some people say absolutely Russia will win. Others, of course, insanely say Ukraine. Ukraine will never win. But will Russia win the war? I don't know. On the battlefield. They may very effectively have forced negotiations. And their terms are probably going to be very difficult pill to swallow for a lot of these liberal elites. But it's unmistakable that our policies have become the same policies as the British Empire. And the antagonism of Russia in Ukraine is explicitly a reference point for that kind of disease that we've been infected by. Because as good Americans, everyone can tell we have no interest in what happens, since what nationality and what nation they identify with in southeastern Ukraine. We have no concern over that. If they want to be Russian, they can be Russian. If they want to be Ukrainian, they can be Ukrainian. If they want to fight it out over it, then let them fight it out over it. But it's not really a major concern of the American people. We might want to prevent loss of life as a humanitarian concern, as Trump has made clear. And that's what Trump's policy and any decent American policy would be. If we can play a role in shutting down the wars, we should do so. That should have been US policy in World War I. We should have come in as the key broker to say, whatever side we joined, whether it was Germany or France, Britain and Russia, whatever side we entered, we would have made the difference. And we should have said, so you're going to stop the battles and we're going to negotiate a long-term lasting peace. And World War I would have ended a year earlier, if we had intervened. And World War II would have never happened. World War II would have never happened had we had that traditional American foreign policy. People might ask, when did this policy change? One reference point is the Pentagon Papers. These are somewhat famous. Senator Mike Gravel, who was someone we got to know, got them published, made them declassified. but they were leaked by a whistleblower, Daniel Ellsberg. But despite that process that happened in the 1970s, more importantly is what the Pentagon Papers said at the very beginning regarding our policy in Vietnam. And what it said was that in 1945, after the war was over, World War II, the Japanese had conceded, our foreign policy shifted from supporting Ho Chi Minh and his nationalist program for Vietnam to become a sovereign nation led by Vietnamese to re-supporting French colonization as basically France is kind of like a junior partner in British colonial policies. And that at that point, our policy had shifted. Winston Churchill made this clear in his speech in Missouri, Iron Curtain speech. He actually called for the United States to basically join the Commonwealth, the British Commonwealth, and have basically a new English-speaking kind of empire around the world. He called, after World War II, this was the level of power and hubris of the British, even after World War II, was to ask us to come in as the junior partner of an English-speaking empire. So this reference to the British is critical, not just because it provides some kind of name for the boogeyman of the globalists, but because we have to be able to recognize that the policies we're adopting and the framework of which we adopt those policies are very much easily identified with a source. And that source is the British Empire, which didn't really end until, well, you know, it ends maybe in 48 when you finally get rid of India and Pakistan and you announce them to be independent. So I say all that because what Trump is presenting is a remarkable solution. And he did it again in a unique way. Keisha references. So if people may know, in 1876, this is something that the LaRouche movement was really kind of has heralded for decades. When we found out that there was such a thing called the American system, that there was this 19th century economic school of thought called the American system of political economy, it was kind of a stunning discovery because why didn't anybody know about this? Here we are like 1960s and nobody knows about what was dominant just 80 years prior. And one of the high points of that American system of political economy was a celebration of our 100th birthday, 1876 Centennial Fair in Philadelphia. Now, Keisha just referenced that, an article by Bob Ingram. She'll post it in the chat. And if you haven't read it yet, we certainly would encourage that. This was a demonstration of massive industrial capacity of the United States. The largest steam engine ever built was demonstrated there. It was running at that time because of the steam engine. You could run powered machinery through systems of belts that were then tied to the main engine. And so a factory was built there with belts all along the ceiling that were powering hundreds of different machines from this one major steam engine. It was a kind of demonstration of industry that was just shocking. People like Westinghouse were there, who then ends up going and founding the Westinghouse Company. People like Alexander Graham Bell had his first telephone there to be demonstrated. Thomas Edison was demonstrating certain capabilities of his electrical systems, which were then brought to Germany, not by Siemens, but by Rathenauer, another major German industrialist. Henry Ford's father was there and came back, somewhat cynical going to it, came back with an unbridled level of optimism about the country and the economy and the industry and science that this country was engaged in. That what Benjamin Franklin had imagined as the world's leading scientist when he was helping to fight and win the Revolutionary War and establish a republic, had now burgeoned within 100 years, just 10 years practically since the elimination of chattel slavery by a nation voluntarily, as a system of economy. Because as much as the British might have outlawed slavery in the UK, it was alive and well in India. the gem of the empire, the jewel of the empire. But we voluntarily eliminated and ended a system of slavery through a civil war, through ending a rebellion. But it was a sovereign decision, and to advance then the quality of sense of human identity through that economic capacity. So it was just an amazing question. People came here, it's hard to imagine, but maybe easy to understand. In the 19th century, a constant attack was, the United States is this kind of immoral place. It says it's premised on liberty and equality and freedom, and yet it has this system of slavery. But within 10 years of ending the Civil War, 5 years of connecting the Transcontinental Railroad, here's this centennial fair in Philadelphia. And people from Japan come. They bring their own economic contributions. I think the British, it was always kind of the laughing joke, the British brought tea from India. I mean, that's how bad the British had become. The King of Brazil comes. Mendeleev, the founder of the periodic table, comes from Russia. It was a global event that shaped foreign policy and shaped the policies of nations like Germany, Russia, Japan, Brazil, China. From that point forward, these are the nations which today are had rapidly industrialized, had developed major infrastructure. And in some ways, this was the great concern of the British Empire. They saw that not only had the United States ended the Civil War, which they had supported and financed, we had eliminated a potential British takeover of Mexico through the Habsburgs in an attempted coup, and that we helped bring to bear the first Native American president of Mexico, Benito Juarez. So we had helped establish sovereignty in the Americas, ended slavery, pushed back the British and imperial tendencies from Europe, and now rapidly industrialized, and nations like Germany and Russia, and Japan and China, who had been subjected to these imperial policies as well, saw the opportunity to aggressively move towards scientific and industrial advancement. Well, what President Trump called for last week was a year-long celebration of our 250th birthday, what we might call the Quarter Millennial Celebration, looking towards the fact that our nation will survive for 1,000 years and more, a full millennial, but we are celebrating our 250th birthday. And he said he'll work with the governors. He's going to hold major celebrations and competitions of high school students and some athletic competitions. He also wants to host a major year-long fair near the Mississippi River in Iowa, in the very heart of the country, with every state contributing. Now, this, of course, can only echo that 1876 celebration. And it's just kind of, Trump is obviously very keen on some of this history. He's also got some smart advisors that he recognizes their material, but all of this really came from some of our historical work. So we take great pride, but we want to make sure this is what it can be. There's a couple of things that have happened that are really worth thinking about. How do we make such a great American fair truly worthy of our 250th birthday, and also have the impact of that on the global policy? Because this is how American foreign policy was shaped. It was shaped by rapid scientific and industrial advancement that then we made available to the rest of the world. We didn't go around pushing our ideological doctrines like these numbskulls in Washington and the State Department do today. And that's the best of them. The worst of them, of course, are running major coups and working with drug cartels and criminal operations. We might make funding available through an export-import bank or other banking capabilities, so we have lines of credit so that they can buy American industry. But it was driven by this scientific and industrial program that, in essence, that is a truly sovereign foreign policy approach. We're not worried about our borders. Well, we are. I mean, we're not, but unlike China, which has something like, I think Russia has 19 or 20 bordering countries. China has something even more bizarre, something like 25 or 30. We have Canada and Mexico. And of course, we have to worry about those borders. But it's not a question of skirmishing over territory. It's a question of dealing with this massive migration and kind of globalization policy and drug cartels that we've got to actually deal with. And these are different criminal elements than just Mexico and the United States contesting over territory. So how do we do this with the Great American Fair? And that's partly what we want to drive. We want to get out and organize around what Trump is doing. If you didn't see Tony Pappert's presentation from Saturday, he makes a clear point using Charles de Gaulle of France, that there comes a moment, like with Lincoln in the Civil War, or even Franklin Roosevelt in the Depression. But Charles de Gaulle, at a point where his nation was nearly eliminated and destroyed as a nation, and yet he leaving the country, going to London as the Nazis took over France, heralded the true France, what he called the Fighting French. But the true France would continue to live and embodied by one person. That the spirit of a people that are looking towards the success of their future can sometimes be captured in a single individual, given their willingness to put themselves on the line. Trump has done that. And if you want to see that argument develop more, I really encourage people to listen to Tony's presentation. What can we do with the Great American Fair to live up to what President Trump represents? Well, as Keisha and I both know well, and Keisha may want to say more on this as we get into some discussion, Trump launched the Artemis Project. This was a colonization of the moon, and then using the moon as a station, permanently manned, industrialized robotics, scientific laboratories, astronomical investigations, but also then as a launch pad for explorations to Mars and eventually a colonization of Mars. So he launches this project. It's an ongoing living project. But out of this came a concept called the Artemis generation. That an entire generation would be determined by the fact that mankind would finally, because of the ability to develop a sovereign republic of the United States, which rapidly accelerated mankind's development in ways that may have never been able to be done had we not formed a nation and a concept of a country as ours is. That mankind as a species, all of us, all of humanity, all of human civilization will then become extraterrestrial. That's as extraordinary in our minds as setting up a new colony in a completely new continent was in the early 1600s, when the first colonies were shaped onto the Americas. So, as Trump called for competitions, and Bob Ingram referenced this, with high school students and athletic competitions, which would be fun for young people. We need a vibrant, healthy young people. We might not need as much of the arena games as we have, but we do need healthy, athletic, physically active young people. But we also need young people who are ready to participate and contribute to the Artemis generation. And this is what echoes the Alexander Graham Bells, the Edisons. There were new kinds of food, new kinds of medicines, people doing, different approaches towards health, different proposals for healthcare systems, hospital systems, we had Heinz Ketchup was at the Centennial Fair. But this fair can be a contribution from high school, but also every major college in the country. How are we going to colonize the moon? What technologies are needed? What power supplies? What kinds of robotics? What kinds of machinery? What kind of experiments? What kinds of industry? What can we use the lunar soil for? All of this should be a challenge to every university who can provide the best proposals in a number of these different categories. The same can be true for power systems on Earth, nuclear, fusion, matter, antimatter proposals. We want to break out the American imagination and ingenuity in ways that people would think could never happen and coalesce it around the true celebration of the country. This is what Ulysses S. Grant saw in that 1876 fair when he was as president. He knew he wanted to echo that quality of spirit and mind that was Abraham Lincoln, who was as much of an impassioned scientist and thinker as he was a great political leader. Now, what's also interesting, and this is just kind of a footnote to that proposal, and there's many different things we can think about: food supply, new types of foods, new types of medicines. I mean, it can be anybody can participate. This is the Great American Fair. Now, you might not, the one in 1876 was 6 months long. You might not have a booth there for 6 months or a year. You might do it for a month. But it's a chance for every American to come and share their contributions, their discoveries, their inventions with the rest of the country. And really, to a large extent, if we set the scientific standard where the United States is really is the world's leader in questions of space exploration and this kind of advanced technology, the whole world will want to come just to see what's happening here. What's really going on in the United States, because everyone can see it. There is a major political fight happening in our country that determines war and peace for the entire world. They see it, maybe even better than many Americans see it. And it's the fight around what President Trump represents. Now, just as a footnote to this, about 2 weeks ago, Japan's cabinet, so its top set of ministers, put out a report sanctioned by its Ministry of Technology. And this was a report that said Japan recognizes that the future energy supply is going to be fusion power. And they are now calling to marshal all of their national industry. Now, remember, this is a nation which rapidly industrialized over a kind of a nationalist perspective, where the government and major industrial firms were formed in partnership to rapidly industrialize the country after World War II. They're calling for that kind of relationship between government, finance, and its major heavy industries, of which it still remains top in the world, among the top countries in the world, to marshal towards the development of commercial fusion. Commercial fusion has not even has not been demonstrated yet in any lab or any experiment that we can run a power plant on fusion. But the Japanese recognize this is going to happen, and that supply chains, new technologies, new industries, new materials, and the ability to contribute to what will be a fundamental leap, and this is what the Japanese report even itself says, will be a leap like from an agricultural society into the industrial age. It'll be like a new industrial revolution, this kind of process of contributing commercial fusion power. So at the same time that we're fighting this fight, you can see that the rest of the world is ready for a kind of collaborative effort to rapidly advance the human civilization. And this is where competition can be healthy. It's almost like a moonshot on the ground. Who can master commercial fusion? Who can develop it? There's not going to be just be one type of machine. There's going to be different types of apparatus that master this fusion technology, this high intense plasma capability. And there'll be different applications, one of which will be for commercial power use, but there'll be many different applications. But the fact that a nation and a clear partner and ally of ours is calling for this direction shows that it's a same kind of science driver approach can and has to be adopted in the United States. And this is part of what, or we might say this is what ultra MAGA, what really making America great again looks like. So it's time to reject the takeover of the British policies. Since 1901, when we adopted the FBI in 1905 to hunt down German Americans as possible spies, we adopted the Federal Reserve. We adopted a British agenda and program in so many different ways that betrayed our own tradition, just like the Pentagon Papers said we betrayed our own policies in Vietnam in 1945. We betrayed them here in our own country in the early 1900s. But what Trump represents, why this moment is so special, why we want to get out and communicate the potential we face today, is because it's to go back to that level of real industry and growth, real scientific advancement that makes people so proud to be Americans, where we get rid of this cynical slime of bemoaning our crimes and mistakes. We've made major mistakes. There's no doubt of that. But the potential we can mobilize in this country is still perhaps unparalleled in the world. And we've got to demonstrate that. And that's really American foreign policy. And it's what drives American success here in our own country. So that's what I wanted to present tonight. Those are I think, some of the things that have broken out in the last couple of weeks that we think are critical. So Keisha, I think I'll end my comments there, and I guess we can find out what everybody else is thinking.